The plane caught fire and started falling. But see what this girl did. Hello, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment what you think is going to happen, and let's see if you get it right. Write your prediction below, and at the end, I'll give you the answer. The day had started just like any other for Emily. A calm morning, a cup of coffee, and the final packing of her things as she prepared to board the flight back home. She had spent the last 2 weeks attending business meetings in a city far from her small hometown, and she missed the familiarity of her everyday life. As she made her way through the busy airport, she thought about her parents, who were eagerly awaiting her return. The anticipation of sleeping in her own bed filled her with a quiet joy. Boarding the plane, she found her seat near the window and leaned back, letting out a sigh of relief that her journey home had begun. As the plane took off, Emily gazed out the window, watching the ground grow smaller and the sky stretch endlessly before her. The world below seemed peaceful, unaware of the turbulence that was about to unfold thousands of feet in the air. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering snacks and drinks, and passengers settled in for what they believed would be a routine flight. Emily was no different, closing her eyes for a quick nap to pass the time. But as the plane reached cruising altitude, something felt off. A faint smell lingered in the air, something burning. She brushed it off at first, thinking it might just be the engines or the equipment. But as the minutes ticked by, the smell became stronger, and whispers began to ripple through the cabin. It didn't take long for the quiet concern to escalate into full-blown panic. The lights flickered, and a subtle rumbling noise grew louder from the back of the plane. Flight attendants hurried down the aisles, their expressions tight with fear, despite their efforts to remain composed. A sharp voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing an emergency situation. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened and follow the instructions of the crew." Emily's heart raced as she clutched the armrests of her seat, her pulse quickening with each second. She glanced out the window, and to her horror, she saw the flames. The wing of the plane was on fire. The fire spread rapidly, and the cabin filled with smoke. Panic took over as passengers screamed and scrambled for the oxygen masks. Emily's mind raced, her instincts telling her to stay calm, but her body was frozen in fear. The plane began to jolt violently, and she knew they were losing altitude fast. Fear hung thick in the air, and all she could hear was the deafening roar of the wind and the chaos around her. Gripping her seat, she thought about her family and how this might be the end. But deep inside her, a small voice told her to fight. This was not over yet. The chaos in the cabin was unbearable. People were shouting, crying, and gasping for air as smoke filled the plane. Emily's heart raced, but she knew she had to act. Her father's words echoed in her mind, reminding her that panic only made things worse. He had been a firefighter for most of his life, and he'd always taught her that in an emergency, staying calm was the only way to survive. She gripped her armrest tighter, closed her eyes, and forced herself to take a deep breath. When she opened them again, she was focused. She had to help. Looking around, she saw flight attendants trying their best to calm the passengers, but it was clear they were overwhelmed. Some passengers were standing up, struggling with their oxygen masks, while others clung to their seats, paralyzed by fear. The air was thick with smoke, and the rumbling of the failing engines seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Without thinking twice, Emily unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, moving toward one of the flight attendants. "What can I do to help?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. The attendant, a young woman with wide, terrified eyes, blinked at her in shock. Emily could see the panic in her face. "We need to get everyone calm," the attendant replied. "We're preparing for an emergency landing." The words hit Emily like a punch in the gut. An emergency landing. It was happening. This plane was going down, and she had no idea if they would survive it. But there was no time to dwell on that now. She moved back to her seat, grabbed her own oxygen mask, and put it on, then turned to the elderly woman sitting next to her. The woman was trembling, tears streaming down her face. Emily gently placed the oxygen mask over the woman's mouth and nose, helping her secure it. "Breathe slowly," she whispered, squeezing the woman's hand in reassurance. "We're going to be okay." The plane jolted violently, throwing Emily against her seat. She gritted her teeth and held on as the cabin shook. Her mind raced, thinking of what they could do. She noticed a man in the row ahead of her, staring blankly at the chaos around him. He looked like he was in shock, completely frozen. Emily moved toward him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Hey, look at me," she said, her voice firm but calm. "We need to stay focused. We're going to get through this." The man blinked, his eyes clearing as if he were snapping back to reality. He nodded slowly, pulling his mask over his face. Emily moved through the cabin, helping where she could, her heart pounding but her mind clear. She wasn't going to let fear take over. Not now, when it mattered the most. The situation inside the plane was growing worse by the second. The fire had spread, and Emily could feel the heat intensifying as the minutes ticked by. The plane was losing altitude rapidly, and the once calm skies outside the window were now filled with thick, dark smoke. Emily's chest tightened, but her determination only grew stronger. She moved through the aisles, urging people to sit down and stay calm. The flight attendants were doing their best, but it was clear they were relying on Emily's composure to keep the passengers in check. As she reached the front of the plane, Emily overheard the pilot's voice crackling over the intercom. "Brace for impact," he said, his voice strained but controlled. "We're making an emergency landing in a nearby field. Follow all safety procedures." The announcement sent another wave of panic through the passengers, but Emily stayed focused. She glanced toward the cockpit and saw the co-pilot exiting, his face ashen. He was clearly shaken, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "We have a chance," he muttered to the flight attendants, though his voice was filled with uncertainty. Emily knew they needed a clear plan. She approached the co-pilot and caught his attention. "What's the situation?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. He looked at her, surprised by her calmness amidst the chaos. "We've lost an engine, and the fire is spreading. We need to make an emergency landing, but it's going to be rough." Emily nodded, absorbing the gravity of the situation. "How can I help?" she asked. The co-pilot hesitated for a moment before answering. "We need to prepare everyone for impact. Make sure they're braced and secured. And pray." Determined to do everything she could, Emily turned to the flight attendants and began organizing the passengers. She moved from row to row, ensuring everyone knew how to brace for impact. She made eye contact with each person she helped, offering them a few words of reassurance as she secured their seatbelts and instructed them on the crash position. Even though fear gripped her own heart, she refused to let it show. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone on board. They were depending on her, and she wasn't going to let them down. The plane lurched again, and the ground below grew closer. Emily hurried back to her seat, fastening her seatbelt and gripping the armrests tightly. The roar of the wind outside was deafening, and the flames from the engine cast an eerie orange glow through the windows. She took one last deep breath, her thoughts racing back to her family. Then, in a split second, everything went silent. The impact was coming, and all they could do was hold on. The world seemed to stop for a moment. The plane, now a massive burning metal shell, was plummeting toward the ground with terrifying speed. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but the silence inside the cabin was eerie. Everyone was bracing for impact, their faces pale, knuckles white as they gripped their seats. For a split second, time felt frozen, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Then, with a deafening roar, the plane slammed into the ground. The impact was violent, unlike anything Emily had ever felt. She was thrown forward, her seatbelt biting into her chest as the force of the crash knocked the wind out of her. The plane skidded along the ground, tearing through trees and dirt, shaking violently as metal screeched against earth. Overhead compartments burst open, spilling luggage and debris into the aisles. The cabin was filled with screams, the terrifying sound of chaos in every direction. Emily gritted her teeth, gripping the armrest with all her strength as the plane jolted and spun, pieces of the fuselage tearing away. For what felt like an eternity, the plane continued its destructive path, until finally, with a sickening jolt, it came to a stop. The silence that followed was almost as unbearable as the crash itself. Emily's ears rang, and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air, but she was alive. Slowly, she opened her eyes and took in the wreckage around her. The plane was broken. Pieces of the fuselage crumpled and scattered across the field. Fires burned in parts of the cabin, but the worst of the flames seemed to have subsided. Emily's body ached, but she forced herself to move, unbuckling her seatbelt with trembling hands. Around her, passengers were beginning to stir, some dazed and injured, others too shocked to move. She knew they didn't have much time before the situation could get worse. The fire could reignite, or worse, the fuel tanks could explode. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily pushed herself out of her seat and started moving through the wreckage. "Is everyone okay?" she called out, her voice hoarse but loud enough to carry through the cabin. She helped those who were closest to her first, pulling people from their seats and urging them toward the emergency exits. The smell of fuel was overpowering, and the heat from the fires grew stronger with each passing second. Emily knew they had to get out fast. She reached the emergency exit door and, with a grunt of effort, forced it open. Fresh air rushed in, and for the first time since the crash, there was a sliver of hope. She turned back to the passengers still trapped inside, waving them forward. "Come on, we have to move," she shouted. One by one, people started climbing over seats, making their way toward the exit. The smoke was thick, and the heat was unbearable, but they had a way out. Emily wasn't going to let anyone die today. The cool rush of air outside the plane felt like a lifeline as Emily helped the last few passengers climb through the emergency exit. Her arms ached, her lungs burned from the smoke, but she kept pushing forward. Each second was a battle against time as the fires inside the plane continued to spread. The crackling of the flames and the groaning of the damaged fuselage were relentless reminders that they weren't safe yet. Outside, chaos reigned. Passengers who had already escaped were huddled together in the open field. Some crying, others in shock, staring at the wreckage with wide, terrified eyes. Some were nursing injuries, while others desperately called for loved ones still inside the plane. Emily turned back toward the plane, her mind racing. There had to be more survivors. She had to check, but as she moved to re-enter, an explosion shook the ground beneath her feet. The remaining engine had burst into flames, sending a wave of heat and debris through the air. Emily stumbled backward, shielding her face from the blast. The explosion rocked the wreckage, but her resolve held strong. If there were still people inside, she couldn't leave them behind. Ignoring the growing flames and the throbbing in her head, Emily ran back to the opening of the plane. "Is anyone still in there?" she shouted into the smoke-filled cabin, her voice hoarse and broken. For a moment, all she could hear was the crackling of the fire and the distant shouts of the passengers already outside. Then a faint voice called back, "Help!" Emily's heart skipped a beat as she squinted through the thick smoke. A figure was slumped near the back of the plane, pinned under a collapsed seat. Without thinking, she rushed back inside, ignoring the searing heat and the dangerous creaks of the disintegrating plane. The air inside the cabin was almost unbreathable. Emily coughed as she pushed her way through the wreckage, debris falling around her with every step. When she reached the trapped passenger, she saw it was a young girl, no older than 12. The girl's leg was pinned beneath the wrecked seat, her face streaked with tears and soot. Emily crouched down, her mind racing. "I'm going to get you out of here," she promised, her voice steady despite the chaos. Using all her strength, she pushed against the metal seat, but it didn't budge. Panic flickered in her chest. The flames were getting closer, and they didn't have much time. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Emily gripped the seat and heaved with all her might. Slowly, painfully, the seat shifted just enough to free the girl's leg. Without wasting another second, Emily scooped the girl up in her arms and staggered back toward the exit. The heat was unbearable, but she pushed through, her eyes stinging from the smoke as she carried the girl out into the open air. As soon as they were clear, the remaining part of the plane collapsed in a fiery blaze behind them. Emily collapsed onto the grass outside the wreckage, her body trembling from exhaustion. The young girl she had just saved lay beside her, coughing but alive. The roaring flames behind them illuminated the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the field. Emily glanced back at the burning remains of the plane, the realization finally sinking in that they had barely escaped with their lives. Despite the exhaustion coursing through her, she knew there was more to be done. Survivors huddled together in small groups, shivering from shock and the cool night air. Some were tending to the wounded, ripping pieces of clothing to use as makeshift bandages, while others wandered aimlessly, still in disbelief that they had survived. Emily could see the distant lights of emergency vehicles racing toward them, but they weren't there yet. Until help arrived, it was up to her and the others to make sure no one was left behind. She forced herself to stand, pushing through the pain in her muscles, and made her way toward the group of survivors. As she approached, a man came running toward her. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "My wife, she's still inside," he cried, clutching at Emily's arm. His words were barely coherent, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable. Emily felt a surge of dread. She had been sure she'd gotten everyone out, but in the chaos of the escape, it was easy to miss someone. Without hesitation, she turned back toward the plane, but the man grabbed her arm again. "You can't go back in there. It's too dangerous," he shouted, his voice shaking. Emily locked eyes with him and spoke firmly. "I have to try." She sprinted back toward the wreckage, the heat from the fire growing unbearable the closer she got. The twisted metal of the plane groaned under the weight of the flames, and the smoke made it nearly impossible to see. Still, she pressed on, her mind laser-focused on finding the man's wife. As she climbed over debris and fought through the acrid smoke, she could hear faint cries from somewhere inside. Her heart pounded as she followed the sound, praying she wasn't too late. There, trapped under a collapsed section of the fuselage, was a woman, her face streaked with tears and soot, struggling to move. Emily rushed to her side, her mind racing to find a way to free her. The wreckage was heavy, and the fire was closing in fast. "I'm here to help you," Emily said, her voice strong despite the panic rising inside her. "I need you to stay still while I figure out how to get you out." The woman nodded weakly, her breath shallow. Emily scanned the area, looking for anything that could help. She spotted a piece of metal that had dislodged during the crash, and with a quick move, she wedged it under the collapsed section. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emily pushed against the metal, leveraging it to lift the wreckage just enough for the woman to crawl free. It felt like an eternity, but inch by inch, the woman moved until she was clear. Emily grabbed her hand and pulled her to safety, just as the plane groaned under the weight of the flames and collapsed completely. They stumbled out into the field, both gasping for air, the heat of the fire at their backs. Emily felt her knees buckle as she finally allowed herself to collapse, the adrenaline finally fading from her system. The sound of sirens pierced the night as the emergency vehicles finally reached the crash site. Firefighters, paramedics, and police officers flooded the field, their lights flashing against the eerie backdrop of the still smoldering wreckage. Emily lay on the ground, her body weak and trembling, barely able to lift her head as the rescue teams rushed past her. Despite her exhaustion, a deep sense of relief washed over her. Help had finally arrived, and the nightmare might be coming to an end. She watched as firefighters approached the remains of the plane, hoses in hand, battling the flames that had consumed much of the aircraft. Paramedics moved quickly among the survivors, assessing injuries and providing immediate care. Emily's body ached with every movement, but she pushed herself to sit up, her eyes scanning the field for the people she had helped save. The young girl was being treated by medics, wrapped in a blanket and given oxygen. The woman she had rescued moments before was being lifted onto a stretcher, her husband at her side, his face streaked with tears of gratitude. A paramedic approached Emily, kneeling beside her. "Are you okay? Can you stand?" he asked, his voice gentle but urgent. Emily nodded slowly, though every muscle in her body protested the movement. I'm fine," she whispered, her throat raw from the smoke. The paramedic helped her to her feet, and she swayed slightly, the world spinning around her. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself to stay upright. She wasn't done yet. "Are there any more survivors inside?" she asked, her voice shaky but determined. The paramedic glanced back at the burning wreckage, shaking his head. "The firefighters are checking now, but it doesn't look good. You've done more than enough." You need to rest. Emily wanted to argue, to go back and search every inch of the plane herself. But she knew he was right. She had pushed her body to its limit, and now it was up to the professionals. Slowly, she allowed herself to be led away from the scene, her legs barely supporting her weight as she walked toward the group of survivors. As she approached, a murmur spread through the crowd. People began to look up, their eyes filled with gratitude and awe. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she realized they were looking at her. Not as another survivor, but as a hero. One by one, the passengers she had helped began to stand, their eyes locked on her, their expressions filled with thanks. The young girl she had rescued ran up to her, throwing her arms around Emily's waist. "Thank you," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she held them back, placing a gentle hand on the girl's head. The crowd gathered around her, offering words of thanks, some holding her hands, others simply nodding in quiet respect. Emily felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had never imagined that in the midst of such terror, she would be the one to step up and lead. But now, looking into the faces of the people she had saved, she realized something profound. In the darkest moments, sometimes ordinary people could do extraordinary things. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the field where the wreckage of the plane still smoldered. The chaos of the previous night had begun to settle as survivors were taken to hospitals, and the rescue teams conducted their final sweeps of the crash site. Emily sat quietly, wrapped in a blanket, her body too exhausted to move. She watched as the last of the survivors were loaded into ambulances, their faces etched with relief and shock. The adrenaline that had fueled her for so long had finally worn off, leaving her with nothing but the quiet, heavy weight of everything that had happened. As the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, Emily found herself lost in thought. The memories of the crash played over and over in her mind. The fire, the fear, the desperate scramble to save lives. She had acted on instinct, driven by a fierce need to protect the people around her. But now, in the stillness of the morning, she wondered how she had managed to find the strength. The enormity of what had happened started to sink in, and with it came the overwhelming realization of just how close they had come to not making it out alive. She thought of the people who hadn't survived, of those whose lives had been cut short, and a deep sadness settled in her chest. A soft voice broke through her thoughts. "You did everything you could." Emily looked up to see one of the firefighters standing beside her, his face kind but weary from the long night. "You saved lives," he continued, his voice steady and calm. "Not many people would have done what you did." Emily shook her head, her eyes filling with tears she could no longer hold back. "I was just trying to help," she whispered, her voice breaking. The firefighter knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes that's all it takes," he said gently. "You made a difference, and that's what matters." Emily wiped at her eyes, her emotions finally spilling over after holding it all together for so long. She hadn't realized just how much she had been carrying. The fear, the responsibility, the weight of the lives she had helped save. But now, sitting in the quiet aftermath, she allowed herself to feel it all. The grief for those who were lost, the gratitude for those who survived, and the strange, bittersweet pride that came with knowing she had played a part in their survival. She had been an ordinary passenger on that flight, just like everyone else, but in the face of disaster, she had found something extraordinary within herself. As the day wore on, more officials arrived at the scene. Investigators, reporters, and medical personnel, all working to piece together what had happened. Emily watched from a distance, too drained to be involved in the frenzy of activity. She knew there would be questions, interviews, and a long road ahead as they uncovered the full story of the crash. But for now, all she wanted was to rest. The events of the past hours had been more than enough to last a lifetime. She leaned back against the tree behind her, closing her eyes for just a moment, letting the sounds of the world fade as sleep finally claimed her. Emily awoke to the low hum of voices and the distant sound of helicopters. The once quiet field was now a hub of activity, with news crews setting up cameras and investigators combing through the wreckage. The soft blanket of morning had given way to the harsh light of midday, and the world felt strangely normal again, except it wasn't. Emily blinked against the sunlight, her body still stiff and sore from the ordeal. But the peace she had felt in her brief sleep quickly faded as reality rushed back. As she sat up, a paramedic approached her, offering a bottle of water. "You should drink," he said kindly. "You've been through a lot." Emily accepted the water with a nod, her thoughts still a jumble of images and emotions from the crash. She took a sip, the cool liquid soothing her dry throat, and glanced around at the scene unfolding before her. Survivors were being interviewed by investigators and reporters, their faces still pale with shock. The wreckage of the plane, once a terrible inferno, now lay charred and lifeless, a stark reminder of what they had all endured. Emily's heart clenched at the sight, but she forced herself to look away. A sharp voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Harper, can we have a word?" Emily turned to see a group of reporters approaching her, their cameras and microphones ready, eager to capture her story. She had been avoiding the attention, hoping to blend into the background and let the professionals handle the aftermath. But it was clear now that she couldn't hide any longer. She was a key figure in the disaster, the girl who had saved lives, the unexpected hero of the crash. The thought made her stomach turn. She hadn't done any of it for attention. She had acted because it was the right thing to do. Yet here they were, ready to turn her story into headlines. "Just a few questions, Ms. Harper," one of the reporters pressed, her voice eager but not unkind. "The world wants to know what happened up there. How did you stay so calm? What drove you to take control in such a dangerous situation?" Emily hesitated, feeling the weight of their expectant gazes on her. She had never been one for the spotlight, and the idea of her actions being dissected by strangers felt surreal. But as she looked around at the other survivors, some of whom were giving their own accounts, she realized that her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been on that flight, to the families of those who hadn't made it. Maybe sharing what happened could help make sense of the chaos. Taking a deep breath, Emily stood up, brushing off the blanket that had been wrapped around her shoulders. She met the reporter's gaze, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm not sure how to explain it," she began. "When the fire started and everything went wrong, I just knew I had to help. It wasn't something I thought about. I saw people who needed me, and I couldn't stand by and do nothing. I didn't know if we'd make it, but I had to try." The reporters leaned in closer, hanging on her every word. "I think in those moments, you don't really have time to be afraid. You just act," she continued. "I wasn't the only one who helped. There were others. We were all trying to survive." Her words seemed to resonate, and the crowd of reporters fell silent for a moment, processing the humility in her response. Emily felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The chaos of the crash was behind them, but the weight of what they had all gone through would stay with them forever. She had done what she could, and now it was time to find peace in the aftermath. In the days that followed the crash, Emily found herself in a whirlwind of emotions and responsibilities. The media coverage was relentless. Headlines described her as a hero, and her face appeared on television screens and newspaper covers across the country. Despite the attention, all Emily wanted was to return to a sense of normalcy, to fade back into the quiet life she had once known. But there was no escaping the aftermath of the disaster. The world wanted her story, and no matter how hard she tried, it was clear her life had changed forever. She spent long hours in interviews, recounting the events of the crash over and over. Every detail was scrutinized. Her quick thinking, the people she had saved, her ability to stay calm under pressure. She spoke about the fear, the split-second decisions, and the moments when she wasn't sure they would make it out alive. Each retelling took a toll on her, reopening wounds she had hoped would heal. But she did it for the others, for the families who lost loved ones, and for the survivors who had been too overwhelmed to share their stories. Despite the exhaustion, there were moments of comfort. Many of the survivors reached out to her, thanking her for what she had done. The young girl she had saved, Anna, sent her a drawing of the two of them standing by the burning plane, with the simple words, "Thank you for saving me." The image brought tears to Emily's eyes. The bond she had formed with some of the survivors was undeniable, a shared trauma that connected them in ways words could never fully express. They met several times, in small, quiet gatherings away from the prying eyes of the media, where they could talk freely about what they had been through and support each other in their recovery. But even in these moments of healing, the weight of the crash hung heavy on Emily's shoulders. The night terrors started soon after the crash, jolting her awake in the middle of the night, her heart racing and her breath shallow. She would relive the impact, the screams, the heat of the flames licking at her skin. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back on that plane, trapped in those harrowing moments. Sleep offered no escape, and the exhaustion followed her into each day. She knew she needed help, but asking for it felt like admitting weakness, something she wasn't ready to do. One evening, as she sat alone in her small apartment, Emily found herself staring at a letter from one of the victims' families. They had lost their daughter in the crash, a young woman named Sarah, who had been sitting only a few rows behind Emily. The letter was filled with words of gratitude, thanking Emily for all she had done to save as many lives as possible. But there was also a sadness in their words, a quiet plea for answers. Why had their daughter not made it? Could she have been saved? The letter weighed heavily on Emily's heart. She wanted to reach out, to offer them some comfort, but she had no answers. She had done all she could, but it wasn't enough. That night, Emily made a decision. She would get help. She had carried the burden of the crash alone for too long, and it was time to face the pain she had been running from. She called a therapist who specialized in trauma, and for the first time since the crash, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could heal from the scars it had left behind. The day of Emily's first therapy session felt like a turning point, though she had no idea what to expect. Sitting in the waiting room, her fingers nervously twisted the edge of her jacket. The crash had brought her to this moment, but now that she was here, the weight of everything she'd experienced felt heavier than ever. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding inside: fear, guilt, and the overwhelming sense of responsibility for what had happened on that plane. Her therapist, Dr. Harper, greeted her with a calm smile, inviting her to sit and share whatever she felt comfortable with. The room was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold memories that haunted Emily's thoughts. For the first few sessions, Emily found it hard to open up. She spoke in fragments, recounting the events of the crash in bits and pieces, careful not to linger too long on any one memory. The fiery wreckage, the screams of the passengers, and the weight of the lives she couldn't save were still too raw. But Dr. Harper was patient, allowing Emily to move at her own pace, gently guiding her to confront the trauma she had buried so deep. Slowly, Emily began to unravel the complex web of emotions she had carried since that fateful day. She talked about the panic, the split-second decisions, and the terrifying moments where she feared she wouldn't make it out alive. What Emily struggled with the most wasn't the fear, though. It was the guilt. The faces of the people she couldn't save haunted her. She found herself replaying the crash in her mind, wondering if she could have done more. Every time she thought of the passengers who hadn't made it, the guilt threatened to overwhelm her. "I should have gone back sooner," she confessed during one session, her voice trembling. "I could have saved more of them if I'd been faster." Dr. Harper listened carefully, her expression soft but firm. "Emily, you did more than most people would ever be capable of. You can't carry the weight of everyone on that plane. You saved lives, and that matters." But the guilt wasn't just about those who hadn't survived. It was also about the attention she had received afterward. People called her a hero, but she didn't feel like one. She had acted on instinct, doing what she thought anyone would have done in the same situation. Yet the media had turned her into a symbol of bravery, and it didn't sit right with her. "I don't deserve all this attention," she admitted during another session. "I wasn't trying to be a hero. I didn't want to see people die." Dr. Harper nodded, understanding the weight of the praise that had been thrust upon her. "Being a hero doesn't mean you don't have doubts or fears, Emily. It means you acted in the face of those fears when others couldn't. That's what makes you remarkable." As the weeks went by, Emily began to feel a shift. She started to come to terms with what had happened, learning to accept that she had done everything she could. The nightmares still lingered, but they were less frequent, and when they came, she no longer felt as helpless. With each therapy session, she found herself growing stronger, more at peace with her role in the disaster. She realized that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but learning to live with it. The The scars would always be there, but they didn't have to define her. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult session, Emily made her way to a small park near her apartment. She sat on a bench, watching the children play in the distance, their laughter a stark contrast to the dark memories she carried. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of calm. The world moved on, and so could she. It wasn't about forgetting, but about finding her place in a world that had shifted so dramatically. She had survived something unimaginable, and now she was ready to rebuild. Months had passed since the crash, and Emily had slowly begun to find her footing again. The whirlwind of media attention had finally died down, and life had returned to a semblance of normalcy. Yet, Emily knew she would never be the same person she was before that flight. The experience had changed her, shaping her in ways she was still coming to understand. The scars, both physical and emotional, would always be a part of her. But she had also discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed, a resilience that allowed her to move forward, even when the weight of the past felt unbearable. It was a crisp autumn morning when Emily decided to visit the crash memorial. The site had become a place of reflection for the survivors and the families of those who hadn't made it. A small monument had been erected, with the names of the victims engraved in stone. Flowers and tokens of remembrance lined the base, left by loved ones and strangers alike. Emily had avoided coming for a long time, unsure if she could face the memories the site would bring back. But today she felt ready. She walked slowly through the field, the leaves crunching under her feet as she approached the memorial. Standing before the monument, Emily ran her fingers gently over the names etched into the stone. She thought of the passengers she had tried to save, the ones whose faces still haunted her dreams. A deep sadness filled her heart, but it wasn't the same overwhelming grief she had once felt. It was softer now, more like a quiet acknowledgement of the lives lost and the pain endured. She had come to understand that she couldn't carry the weight of their deaths alone. It wasn't her fault. She had done what she could, and now, standing here in this quiet place, she allowed herself to let go of the guilt that had clung to her for so long. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard a familiar voice behind her. Emily. She turned to see Anna, the young girl she had saved during the crash, now standing before her with her parents. The girl's face lit up with a smile, and before Emily could react, she rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her waist in a tight hug. "I knew I'd see you here," Anna said softly, her voice full of warmth. Emily knelt down, hugging the girl back, a wave of emotion flooding through her. "I'm so glad to see you," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Anna's parents approached, their eyes filled with gratitude and tears. "We'll never be able to thank you enough for what you did," Anna's mother said, her voice trembling. Emily smiled, brushing away a tear. "You don't have to thank me," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm just glad you're okay." The weight of the past months seemed to lift, even if just for a moment. Seeing Anna, alive and well, reminded Emily of the importance of what she had done. The memory of the crash would always be with her, but so would the knowledge that she had made a difference. She had saved lives, and in the midst of all the pain and fear, that was something she could hold on to. As they stood together by the memorial, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The crash had taken so much, but it had also shown her the strength of the human spirit, the capacity for kindness and courage, even in the darkest moments. She wasn't the same person she had been before the flight, and she didn't have to be. She had survived, not just the crash, but everything that had come after. And now, for the first time in a long time, she was ready to embrace the future. Later that day, as she walked away from the memorial and toward the life waiting for her, Emily knew that she was beginning a new chapter. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be days when the memories resurfaced, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced the fire and the fear, and she had come out on the other side, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. If you like this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And now, you have a new video appearing on the screen, full of unexpected twists and heartwarming moments. Click and get ready for another inspiring story.